Imagine you were an Aztec in the year 1518. Your people and empire had existed for centuries, and before that there were thousands of years of civilization to look back upon. Cities had been getting bigger, the empire had grown, and things appeared moderately okay. The gods watched over, and the world made sense. And then the next year, some pale gods riding deer and carrying sticks that made thunder arrived. Within 3 years, 90% of your friends, family, and everyone you had known were dead, from a disease the newcomers said came from not following their god, a god you didn't know about 4 years earlier. The foreigners had taken over the entire society, wiping out the old gods, building new cities, and enslaving the people that remained. Everything you had known and loved from 5 years earlier was gone. It sounds like an alien invasion story, but it really happened. Out of the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, or Mexico as they called it, came modern Mexico. However, it was always a near-run thing. The Aztecs nearly butchered the conquistadors and maintained their independence. What if that happened? How would it have affected culture, borders, wars, demographics, and history? That is the question of this alternate history. The Spanish invasion of Mexico was so ridiculous that there are so many points in which, if Cortez, the Spanish leader, had made the wrong decision, these Spanish forces would have just been crushed. There were around 500 Spaniards, while the Aztec population of around 20 million, and could create armies numbering in the tens of thousands. Just for the sake of the timeline, I'm going to say that something goes horribly wrong outside of Veracruz, and these Spanish horses get killed by a mudslide, or eaten by alligators if you prefer. More so than gunpowder, which often had trouble in the humid climate and rivaling metal weapons in importance, horses were the #1 military advantage the Spanish held over the natives. Eurasian militaries had spent millennia evolving against the enormous power of the cavalry charge, and the native Mexican forces, without any experiences with it, were routed by cavalry. Without it, the Spanish would have been crushed at the Battle of Atumba, after they had been driven out of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, and at Atumba, the repeated cavalry charges were what saved them from enormous Aztec numerical superiority. If the Spanish had failed in their initial attack, they wouldn't have succeeded later. The #1 advantage they held was disease, with 90% of the native population dying off from European diseases which they had no immunity to. Given a few decades more, the Aztecs would have been able to breed their population back up to a reasonable level. Similarly, the Aztecs were getting good at adapting to Europe's technological advantages. One of the big reasons the final battle against the Aztecs was fought inside the tiny streets of Tenochtitlan was that the Aztecs figured out the incredible advantages the Spanish had in the open fields with horses and guns, and knew that the house-to-house fighting was their best option. The Aztecs figured out that Spanish guns took a while to reload, and thus would place traps where one group of soldiers would attack the Spanish and another would ambush them while they were reloading. If the Spanish didn't seize Mexico in 1521, they never would have. The Europeans would likely still colonize parts of the New World, although it would be more lackluster. The Spanish had already been establishing colonies in the Caribbean and Central America. The Portuguese were already in Brazil. A few very different shifts would occur. Firstly, that almost all the colonizers of the New World did so to replicate what the Spanish did earlier. Spain got so ridiculously wealthy from the colonization of the New World and used it to launch a series of wars that nearly conquered Europe, that all the other European powers wanted in. Remember, the earliest settlers of America and Virginia settled for gold more than anything else. Even in the colonies that weren't founded for the express purpose of enslaving the native population and getting gold, a significant amount of the settlers arriving were doing so with that fantasy in mind, and thus the total amount of immigration to the New World would be less. The American South would be significantly smaller, and to be fair, I have no idea if Argentina or Paraguay would exist at all in this timeline. A big winner could be Brazil, which had already been founded, and if Argentina and Paraguay didn't exist, could have filled that area, as well as the American North, where the migration from Britain was done for religious reasons and in search of land. The English had already been operating as fishermen off of the coast of Newfoundland and New England, and so it's not hard to imagine using that as a springboard for colonization. Similarly, the French colony in Quebec was found to look for the Northwest Passage to Asia, and after it was, the fur trade became a good way to make money, meaning it still would exist in this timeline. A second huge shift would be that the Inca Empire would survive. Pizarro was driven on by the precedent of the conquest of the Aztec Empire. He even used many of the same tactics as Cortez did in Mexico. Similarly, without control of Mexico, control of Peru would become unwieldy. I'm honestly going to table this for a later video, since the Inca Empire is a topic as expansive as the Aztec and deserves a video in of itself. But just remember that there's a large Andean empire in this timeline South America. There would be large changes in Europe as well. Spain was a relatively poor country before the colonization of the New World. If anyone was going to be a great European power, it would be France. However, Spain, with its enormous amount of gold and silver from the New World, was able to vault itself to position of dominant European power and wage a permanent state of war against everyone else in the continent. Without this large influx of wealth, Spain's rivals would win. France would expand into Italy and the Rhineland, splitting the Low Countries with the Dutch rebels. The Swedish invasion of Germany would succeed, with them seizing Vienna and turning the Germanies into a confederacy based out of Dresden. Sweden would become the great northern European power, expanding across the Baltic and competing with France for the Rhineland. With Sweden as the great central European power, we would likely see France and the Ottomans ally against the Swedes in the late 17th and 18th centuries. Russia, once it would develop enough, would also join this coalition. Britain, with its traditional role of trying to keep Europe divided, and Holland's not wanting France to get too powerful, would support the Swedes. Without Spain's great proselytization of Catholicism, Protestantism would be much more widespread in Europe. All of Germany, Czechia, and Austria would become Protestant under Swedish tutelage, and with a less powerful Spain, it's at least plausible that France would turn Protestant as well. The parallels between the Aztec Empire and the late Roman Republic are really striking. They were both city-states that built up local confederacies and then launched massive wars of conquest for them to create the first unifying empire in their region. They were both peripheral to the older, richer regions around them, but rose to conquer said regions. They were both originally aristocratic democracies in which the emperor was gaining more and more power over time. Something people often forget is that the Aztec Emperor was technically elected by the nobility. Both empires looted their subject populations to a ridiculous degree, in the Aztec world for human sacrifice and in the Roman Republic for slaves to support the Roman ruling class. Both were facing demographic crises as their rate of agricultural advancement couldn't keep up with their populations. The Aztec Empire was facing environmental degradation as the land became overused. Similarly, the Roman Republic, which saw unbelievable misuse of agricultural land. I use this example for one to help contextualize what was actually going on in the Aztec Empire, since I'm betting most of you have a better grasp on European than pre-Columbian American history, and two, to deal with the argument that the Aztec Empire would have inevitably collapsed in on itself if the Spanish hadn't conquered them. That's a reasonable argument, but also it would have been a reasonable argument to say that the decadent and corrupt Rome of 100 BC would have collapsed to barbarian invasion, internal civil war, or some rival power from the east. But then Emperor Augustus showed up, fixed most of the issues, and the Roman Empire survived for another 600 to 1600 years. In reality, the introduction of European technology would completely revolutionize the Aztec Empire. The introduction of European crops, and especially animals, would greatly increase agricultural productivity in Mexico. Lots of regions of North and Central Mexico would suddenly become great cattle country, and Mexico could support many more people. As they would have more resources, the Aztecs would leech off their subject states less, and the empire would maintain more internal unity. Similarly, the enormous decline in population due to disease would lessen the resource strains, the standard of living would go up dramatically. The Aztecs would start to buy European weaponry. In the age of exploration, lots of native regimes tried to replicate European weaponry, and many succeeded. For example, when the French invaded Algeria in the 19th century, the Algerians made better guns than the French did. However, none of them had the centuries of permanent war that allowed the European societies to mass-produce said weapons and raise taxes for standing armies. Strangely enough, the only non-European country that succeeded at this was Japan, which was the one with the social structure closest to Europe. The Aztecs likely wouldn't be able to mass-produce guns, but with their enormous wealth could buy them from European traders in the Gulf of Mexico. The Aztecs, with their greater wealth and long coastline, would be able to buy more guns than their neighbors and gain dominance that way. There's a term for this, called Gunpowder Empire, which is how gunpowder, in every region outside Western Europe, allowed unity as large states could afford to buy or produce cannons especially. This allowed empires such as the Ottomans, Mughals, Songhai, Russia, or the Manchus. With the horse as well, the Aztecs were able to travel further and wage longer campaigns. The Aztecs were able to conquer the Tarascan Empire in western Mexico, its ancestral rival Tlaxcala, as well as the Mayan tribes of the Yucatan. The high grasslands of northern Mexico would suddenly gain value with the introduction of cattle, and the Aztecs would conquer them. They would continue north and seize the Pueblo villages of New Mexico, which the Spanish were able to do easily in our timeline. This would work until the native tribes of Middle America, like the Comanche of Texas or the Apache of Arizona, would gain the horse. These peoples were able to use the horse to incredible effect, becoming Huns of the New World. These two tribes kept the Spanish population of the Southwest puny, with the Spanish population of all of Texas being around 4,000 in 1800. In turn, these tribal peoples would keep the Aztecs from advancing far north of the Rio Grande River. Whether or not the Aztecs would colonize California depends on their naval abilities in the Pacific. The Mojave Desert with the Apache between New Mexico and the habitable regions of California makes an expedition by land unlikely, and the Spanish settled the region by sea. In the south, the Aztecs would butt heads with the Spanish in Honduras, who would likely be able to maintain control over Central America by using drill and standardization of weapons as an advantage. With a low population, expanding borders, and rising agricultural productivity, the population would skyrocket. This really didn't happen in our timeline, since the Spanish enslaved the native population, and slave society is universally of low birth rates, since the slaves are either worked to death before they can breed, or they see little reason to bring children into a world where their lives will be as miserable as their parents. This is why the US has a larger population than Mexico, even though if you're looking at where both nations' populations started, that really shouldn't be the case. I know in this age of moral relativism, we're not supposed to say one religion is inherently better than another, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Christianity is about 1,000 times better than the native Aztec religion. The Aztec religion was brutal, with 1.2 million likely sacrificed to sustain the sun god Huitzilopochtli. For a comparison, the total population of the Aztec Empire was around 20 million. The Aztecs literally started wars to support their human sacrifice needs. Ritual cannibalism was practiced, with those sacrificed becoming meals for the priest class and aristocracy. Interestingly enough, the Aztecs were both the only large civilization to practice cannibalism and the only one without a domesticable source of meat. Having 90% of their population die off while the Christians with awesome power claiming it was their god's doing would be possibly the best argument of all time that the Aztec gods were weak and the Christian one was powerful. Similarly, the Christian god asked for neither human sacrifices nor cannibalism, and his followers seem to have done pretty well for themselves. Christianity became wildly popular. The elite who based their power upon the traditional religions would try to outlaw Christianity and double down on human sacrifices to solidify their power. This is sort of similar to the Chinese and Japanese regimes, who tried to outlaw Christianity so that their Confucian hierarchies wouldn't collapse. Both regimes, however, faced large Christian rebellions that came disturbingly close to winning. Christianity, combined with the general trend of economic revolutions going with political ones, would mean that the Aztec Empire would face an enormous Christian rebellion. Like the Taiping Christian rebels in China, these would be only loosely Christian in the Western sense. In reality, the beliefs would be a mixture of Christianity with Aztec mythology. If I'm being frank, I have no idea how this rebellion would go. How would I? Before we return to the Aztec Empire, we have to figure out what would occur in the rest of the Americas. I'm not sure how events in Europe would have affected those in the New World. Both Sweden and France would be great powers, and Holland would be richer, and thus all would have more resources for colonization if they wanted it. But the way the European balance of power works is the bigger you get, the more enemies you have, and so little can be gained. Spain would likely be in better shape. Without huge amounts of free money from the New World, the Spanish monarchy would have been unable to spend recklessly and thus never build societal institutions that would let them work without said money. Without as many resources to extract from their colonial empires, the Spanish Empire would never really care about their colonial empire, and thus all of Central America would evolve like Costa Rica, the colony in the region the Spaniards ran the least. A Protestant France would also likely have behaved hugely differently to a Catholic one, likely having a stronger emphasis on colonial empire and trade. So we could have seen French colonies survive in places like Brazil, South Carolina, or Quebec. A huge difference would be, as mentioned before, that the US would be very north-heavy. The US, if it existed, would have a capital in Albany. It would be much more like Canada than the US of today. The US would likely abolish slavery in the 18th, early 19th centuries. If the French hadn't built a colony in South Carolina, with most of British America's population in the north, we could have seen the advanced southern Native Americans like the Creek or Cherokee develop an independent native nation that could rival the Americans. Maybe the Aztecs would have sent them wealth to prevent the British Americans from becoming too powerful. To return to the Aztecs, the fate of the Aztec Empire would be determined by their reaction to the Christian revolt. If the Christians succeeded, then the Aztecs would be able to revolutionize their society and change it to a more productive model in a radically shifted world, in the most optimistic view. However, if the forces of reaction won, the Aztec Empire would double down a path of conservatism in a world the Aztec elite would not be equipped to deal with. If the Aztec Empire would be able to reform, it would become the great power of the New World. If it could not, then it would decline like the great Ottoman, Mughal, or Han empires, and eventually become a subsidiary of the Europeans, likely either the British or French state that would dominate the American South. Who knows, maybe even an industrialized Cherokee state would have crushed them. The world has seen stranger things. Whatifalthist, and thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that timeline, please like, comment, subscribe, and stay tuned for future content. Or alternatively, check out my Patreon, where I've got all sorts of cool maps, as well as the first 2 chapters of my history of the world. As always, thank you very much and have a great day.